Good morning and welcome to our September edition of the Brexit webinar of FTA. I'm Pauline Bastidon, Head of European Policy at FTA, and I'm going to take you the third edition of the monthly FTA webinar. My colleague Chris Yardley, who's EU Affairs Manager at FTA, is going to take you through a review of the current rules governing international haulage and what Brexit could mean to international members, after which I will be happy to take some questions. Now, I'm going to give you some house rules for the webinar. Quite important, please keep your microphone and telephone muted during the webinar to avoid any feedback. The webinar will be recorded, so in case you have to leave the webinar in the middle of it, you can always follow it afterwards or encourage your colleagues to do so. The recording will be available on the FTA website as of Monday. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to deal with technical issues during the webinar, but obviously you can always come back to it whenever you want. If you have a question for our question and answer session afterwards, please use the chat box to add any questions throughout the webinar. Unanswered questions and answers will be available to view on the FTA website at the address provided on the slide. The decision to leave the EU is going to affect all segments of the FTA membership. This is quite an understatement. We've had feedback already from different categories of members from all parts of the FTA, and whether it affects them in a good or in a bad way, for sure it's going to have huge implications. In order to help its members during this process, but also to seek to influence the negotiations, FTA has produced an ABC guide to Brexit, which will take you through the key issues we feel that will have to be handled as part of the Brexit negotiations. FTA is going to organize regular Brexit webinars to keep FTA members up to date with the latest developments and to inform FTA members about some of the background information needed to better understand some of the claims that are being made in the press or elsewhere. Past webinars, as I said, can be viewed on the FTA website at any time. Next, please. The political situation at the moment is very fluid. You will not have missed, I'm sure, that there are new ministers in place and that new departments, such as the new Department for Exiting the European Union, which are being staffed at the moment. So obviously the situation will stabilize in the coming weeks and months, but still in transformation. There's also new power dynamics and upcoming elections in Europe. So there are elections in France, for instance, and in Germany that are planned for next year, and that will have also a big implication on how the negotiations will go. The so-called Article 50 process, which is the constitutional process whereby a member state can leave the European Union, is unlikely to start before next year. Now, that's what the Prime Minister has been saying. So we don't have a clear idea of the timing, but it's not going to start this year in any case. Until the withdrawal agreement has been adopted, there will be no practical changes. So for that to happen, you will need to see the negotiations completed. And until then, quite important to remember, all EU rules and obligations will remain in force. And that also means that penalties will remain in force in case the rules are no longer respected. Next, please. This is an overview of our ABC guide to Brexit. The most important one, which also comes first, is access to the single market. This is absolutely essential because a lot of the other issues will actually depend on the kind of access we get to the single market. With certain arrangements, the freedom to set our own customs tariffs, for instance, could be limited, as with the freedom to come up with our own rules, for instance. So something that we will be watching very carefully and try to influence in the coming months. Border controls, that's obviously quite a live issue in France, part of the political debates in advance of the elections, the presidential elections for next year. We've heard a lot of candidates from the right-wing party, which is currently topping the polls, claiming that they want to repatriate the border in the UK. So obviously this is something that would be very damaging to us and create unnecessary delays. So we're going to try and fight that back as hard as we can. And obviously we'll keep you up to date as discussions progress in France and following the elections. The one other thing where we've seen some developments lately is domestic legislation. We understand that the Department for Transport is now going through a better regulation process where they are looking at EU rules that are currently in place that affect transport and see whether to keep them, change them, or get rid of them post-Brexit. Obviously, this is something that we will want to influence a lot, but just to manage your expectations, we've already been told by government that this would not mean no rules, and that a number of EU rules would probably still be enforced post-Brexit because government feels it would make more sense. And finally, in Heathrow, well, there have been some recent developments on this. We understand that a ministerial committee to decide whether to expand Heathrow and to finally come up with a decision regarding the third runway has been set up by the Prime Minister, and that a decision is expected in October. So obviously we'll keep you posted on this one. And finally, just to say that if you're interested in getting more details on any of these points, I would strongly encourage you to listen to our past webinars. Next, please. That's a plea from FTA to its members to provide information, influence, insight as the negotiations proceed. As I mentioned, our news channels are going to carry regular updates and breaking news, and our council meetings will also feature regular updates and discussion opportunities to decide on FTA policy. So if you're not already actively engaged in our various council meetings, I would strongly encourage you to do so. We're already working with the Department for Transport on all the key issues, including their better regulation agenda, to look at domestic legislation, and we will keep doing so in the coming months. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Chris Yarsley, who's going to take you through a presentation of the rules for international haulage and Brexit implications.
Good morning, everyone. So on this slide, it just sets out what the presentation will cover today. The first point will look at what currently exists in place. The next point will be looking at what happens as a result of Brexit and what possibly could be put in place post-Brexit. And then the third point is also what happens in the future. Are there any challenges or opportunities that present themselves to the membership? The presentation will contain some acronyms, but I promise I will do my best to explain them all. But if there are parts that remain unclear, as Pauline said, do leave your questions and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of this presentation, or else in the Q&A document that will be posted alongside the presentation on the FTA website. So if we now move on to the substance of the presentation, this is the current legislative framework. So the first circle is quite self-explanatory. All domestic operators will have an O license in one or more of the traffic areas of the UK, with the addition of a transport manager holding an international CPC if they've had their exams since the changes in 2009, or else you have the option of doing the top-up examination for the international CPC. And once you have that, your operation will be permitted to operate across borders for hire or reward. The second point is that you must currently comply with all necessary legislation, both domestically and internationally. This includes driver's hours regulations, the mobile working time, the roadworthiness of vehicles, the rates and dimensions of vehicles, and also have the digital tachograph installed as the monitoring device. Also, if you cross over into other national EU member states, you'll have to comply with domestic legislation in place, such as weekend traffic bans or minimum wage requirements, for example in France and Germany. But essentially the laws in place are currently designed to produce a level playing field between all road transport operators, both domestic and international. Although it is true to say that this one-size-fits-all way of working does come under some criticism, but that is a different debate for a different time. So, moving on to the road transport situation, I just want to put a caveat in the first bullet point here, saying for domestic operators, as has been alluded to, it must be stressed that there will be no free-for-all once EU drivers' hours rules are no longer directly applicable to the UK. There is the case of there being domestic drivers' hours rules already in place for those drivers out of scope of EU rules, such as certain agricultural drivers and drivers for military equipment, etc., etc. So there is that precedent in place. DfT is currently examining the legal implications of the current regulatory framework in a post-Brexit world. FTA is liaising very closely with the officials to ensure that your views are well placed within their considerations as to what the UK situation will be post-Brexit. And also, if you are attending the FTA Transport Manager sessions, we have a session within that, the conference, looking at these rules under a kind of keep, amend, repeal session that invitees are invited to discuss what they would like to keep in the EU legislation, what they'd like to change, and what they'd like to get rid of. Although it must be said that's not creating FTA policy, it's just to give us an idea of what the membership currently are feeling like. And all information on the Transport Manager sessions can be found on the FTA website. So now the webinar moves on to the part of the debate that most people are asking answers for. However, there is quite little or almost no concrete information that can be given at this time. And certainly there'll be no official confirmation of anything until the Article 50 trigger has been activated by the UK government. Both sides are very clear to say that there will be no discussions about anything concrete until the notification has taken place. And the next slide will contain a few of the scenarios that FTA has already outlined in the previous webinar. So I won't go back over all of them, but I'd like to draw attention to a number of possible outcomes that could happen. However, despite what kind of formal arrangement is put in place, there are a number of rules that international operators will have to comply with. And this is where we enter what is called the ATR Agreement, which is a UN-level agreement, but we'll deal with that in a few slides' time. So here we have the possible arrangements that could be put in place or actually do exist at the moment and are used in certain circumstances. It is a totally non-exhaustive list of possible arrangements. The first FTA webinar that is available on our website went into much greater detail about the kinds of arrangements that currently exist globally. So we'd recommend you going back and looking at this for more information. So the first circle on the EEA, the European Economic Area, is also described as the Norway model. This would mean that the UK would no longer be a full member of the EU, but would still benefit from full access to the single market. It's an almost business as usual model. It would also mean we would be bound by all the rights and obligations, including the highly contentious point of the four freedoms of free movement of goods, capital, services, and where the debate is on people. I conducted a survey of the international membership in the immediate period following the EU referendum, and it was quite clear that continued access to the single market was by far the item most respondents wanted. However, this scenario is looking less likely as more pronouncements are made from politicians on both sides, whereby entry to the single market will require the UK allowing full free movement of people from the EU side, and the UK preparing not to permit this, and that's the UK government side. There are other possible arrangements, and FTA will continue to keep members up to speed with all developments as they happen up to and in the period after the triggering of Article 50. So the second circle looks at the TIR Carnet system. And the FTA operates that in the UK on behalf of the International Road Union and the UN. It exists currently, but in much reduced numbers from the UK since the major eastward expansion of the EU. So maybe it will be quite well less known from members who operate purely within the EU. It's a mix of electronic and paper-based customs clearance that give easy trade facilitation when operating into and or through third countries. The UK could end up with resorting to this system to access the EU. It would require only one document, as the EU is treated as a single bloc, but would require extra paperwork and also the laying down of a significant bond in the form of a financial guarantee. It could be anywhere from £5,000 to £10,000, depending on from HMRC. And the third circle is the ATA Carnet, and it'll be familiar to those of you who move around goods for temporary use before they are repacked and moved on again. Typically, this would cover companies that move, for example, bands equipment or TV audio-visual equipment, sports material around for exhibitions or shows before moving them on to the next thing. So in conclusion to this slide, I just recounted a number of the models that could be used in the future, and some of which already are. We just do not know at this moment in time which one will be put in place, or even if we will have a specific UK deal. All of this will come out in the next couple of years, so please do keep watching at these FTA webinars as time progresses, as this will be one of the methods that we use to communicate to members the information that you will need to know in the future. So here's where some of the acronyms begin, and I promise to get us through them with the minimum stress. So we're talking about the ATR Agreement now. So the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe is a body that covers the wider geographical area of the European continent and sets rules in a whole host of sectors, including transport. And this was concluded in the ATR Agreement. It is a French acronym, but the whole English language name is on the slide, the European Agreement concerning the work of crews of vehicles engaged in international transport. This means that anyone crossing into third countries, such as Ukraine or Russia, still have to comply with the same rules, and these rules currently mirror the EU driving arrest time rules and use the digital tachograph as the enforcement device. So even though the UK is withdrawing from the EU, it is and will remain a signatory of this UN agreement, and therefore will be bound by the commitments contained therein. This means post-Brexit, operators who cross over into France and other EU countries will still need to respect the 4.5 hours of driving followed by a 45-minute break requirement and all other aspects of the EU driver's hours rules. Essentially, in this respect, nothing will change for them. And this, conversely, will be the same for vehicles entering the country. So you can be rest assured that the UK will not suddenly become some kind of Wild West country where foreign operators have a carte blanche to travel wherever, whenever. So this slide is just gives you a visual interpretation of some of the key driver's hours rules to help better view the situation between the two, i.e. no difference. So here we move on to one of the possible dangers of Brexit for international operators, and it all wrapped up in the ATR agreement, which we've just covered, and its relationship with EU rules. At the moment, the ATR agreement contains specific references to the technical annexes of the current legislation regarding the digital tachograph. So this means all the fine print of the legislation that deals with exactly how the device works and its technical capabilities. So all the amendments that have taken place over the last couple of years, and some people may be aware of the change to the 1-minute issue, for example, whereby the tachograph registered drive for any part of a calendar minute. That calendar minute would have been registered as drive, but now it's the activity that forms the greatest part of that calendar minute. So, for example, multi-drop operators were complaining that even if the tachograph had 1 second of drive in the minute, the whole minute counted as drive, and therefore they were losing drive time available to them compared to the old analog tachograph. So all of this has taken place within technical annexes that have been passed through the legislative process here in Brussels and automatically they have then changed in the ATR Agreement. However, last year, the European Union passed a new law with a whole new technical annex to introduce what it's describing as the smart tachograph. And this will be coming on the market from 2019, and it will have satellite positioning installed and the ability to be read at distance by roadside enforcement officers. Now this has led some non-EU but AETR countries to complain that they will need to change all their rules to remain in line with what they are now seeing as an EU tachograph that will use, for example, the forthcoming Galileo satellite network. For example, Russia has its own satellite network and it's not sure that it'll be compatible with these new rules. So this means that the rules could end up becoming divergent unless political agreement is reached in Geneva where the UNEC is based. And this is not certain. So in the past, this would not have caused UK operators much concern. But as we approach non-EU AETR status, this has suddenly risen up the priority list. Our operators could be faced with using the older version tachographs in the UK, but being required to have the smart tachograph in the EU, but having no access to it from the UK. FTA is a full member of the IRU, which also includes Ukraine and Russia as its membership and is based down in Geneva. So we'll be using our influence within this trade body, this global trade body, to push for both sides to arrive at a suitable agreement as quickly as possible. So in conclusion, I just want to say the first thing is that in the future, there's going to be no free-for-all for anyone. There will be rules consistently in place post-Brexit for international operators, both within the UK and also on the continent. FTA is closely involved in all discussions at UK, EU and at UN levels, and we call upon our members to keep supplying us the information that we need to help advance your interests in these different levels and different organisations at these levels. So thank you very much for viewing this presentation. I'm now going to hand back to Pauline.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I think we can now start taking questions. So as I explained earlier, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to type them in your question box. So if you have a look at your screen, you should see various lines, including one called questions. And if you use that chat box to ask any questions, we will then be able to see them and answer them. Okay, I think we have a first question on the driver CPC and whether this is something that would keep applying to UK companies post-Brexit and what are the implications for international hauliers based in the UK.
Okay, that's quite an interesting question. So we started off by saying that all current EU regulations and rules will continue to apply. So the FTA advice to members would be absolutely to keep maintaining your training provision up, certainly into the next round past 2019, because there's a strong possibility that the UK will still be bound by the driver CPC in that respect. Also, if you are employing EU nationals as drivers, they will still require a driver CPC when they travel onto the continent. The same if you're a UK driver, and also then you're employed by a company based within the EU, you will also need to maintain a driver CPC status. So that's again an example of legislation that's very key that needs to be continue to be complied with up to and post Brexit.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I think if I may add to that, obviously there might be transitional measures as well in the future, as it's unlikely that we would just jump on the cliff very, very quickly following withdrawal from the EU. And if that were the case, then it's quite possible that most of these rules will keep applying for a few years until they're replaced by something else even for domestic audiences. This is something that we will be able to discuss in more details, by the way, at our next webinar, which will focus specifically on the issues of skills, workforce, and training. So here's a list of dates for the forthcoming FTA webinars. The next one will take place on the 21st of October. And as I say, we'll focus on skills and training more specifically, as well as access to appropriate workforce post-Brexit. Then there will be another webinar on the 22nd of November and one on the 13th of December. And these are likely to look at trade aspects, what would be needed for the UK in order to set its own trade policy, as well as the domestic legislation aspect, with possibly an update on where government is in terms of better regulation agenda and results of surveys and consultations that we will carry on in the coming weeks as to the views of FTA members. I see that we have another question, which is on the right to operate. Will foreign nationals require a work permit of some sort? Chris, if you can answer that quite quickly. That's a difficult one.
Yeah, it's a very difficult one, and this is going to be wrapped up in all the negotiations on Brexit regarding EU nationals in the UK and also UK nationals in the EU. At the moment, there is that 5-year period where if you're consistently registered in another country for 5 years, then you get sort of automatic guarantees of rights of residency. Again, that's just under current EU rules. So in the future, this would need to be negotiated and form part of the discussions between the UK government and the European Union. So foreign nationals operating in the UK requiring a work permit, possibly, but that would be for the UK government to decide. I mean, if they decided to, well, at the moment it's free movement of EU nationals, and if they could continue that, or they could put some kind of work permit situation in place. But again, that's for the UK government to decide on its own sort of immigration policy. At the moment, it's looking like there will be some kind of barrier to entry for EU nationals. Does that mean it's easier for non-EU nationals to qualify for entry into the UK? We don't know at the moment, but it's it's due to the subject of driver shortage and you know, the workforce requirements in the logistics sector in the UK. It's definitely one of the topics that we have looked at and we will continue to look at within these seminars on the web and also within our discussions with the UK government.
Yes. Absolutely, and we're collecting statistics as well to better understand what's the number of and percentage of EU non-UK nationals working for UK companies in the sector, and making the case to ministers that perhaps logistics needs some kind of special treatment in that respect in order to be able to retain and keep employing workers from wherever, based on their competence and on need. And that's something that we'll discuss in more details during the next webinar. So thank you. I think time is up. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that you found the webinar useful and worthwhile, and that you will join us for future editions. Please keep checking our news channels for more updates. And if you are not already involved in our council meetings, please do get involved, because that's where you'll be able to have a say. So thank you very much, and I look forward to spending more time with you during the next webinar.